My name is John Bosnitch. I'm a Canadian of ethnic Serb origin. I grew up in Canada. I left Canada after putting 2 police in prison and went to Asia. Ended up in Japan, where I became the advisor to the Japanese Prime Minister's office. After that, I left Japan, went to Serbia, and helped organize the defense of Slobodan Milosevic at The Hague. I have since been active in many international cases. I left Japan after freeing Bobby Fischer, world chess champion Bobby Fischer, from unlawful arrest at the hands of the United States. I've been active all over the place on every principled issue that I could get involved with, including Julian Assange, including Saif Gaddafi's liberation, including calling out NATO as the warmonger organization that it is, and generally calling out the United States as a hegemon and an imperialist power. That's it, and that's an unusual view for most Canadians. Most Canadians were quite content to live under the American tent for all of these years, denying complicity in the war crimes and in the global endless wars, until suddenly Donald Trump came back into office and said, Canada, you've got a trade imbalance with us. We're going to put sanctions, or we're going to put tariffs on you.
So how's that gone down in Canada? Very
terribly, as you can imagine, because to use an old-fashioned farmer expression here from Canada, if you're used to just sucking on the hind tit for all of your life, you expect everything to go your way and having nothing to do. Well, we were the runt of the Anglo-American war empire. We have a big country per capita. We're the least populated major country in the world. Our country is full of oil and gas and resources and fresh water and uranium, everything you need to run a war empire. And we had a small voice. We just tagged along, and we lived a very well-to-do lifestyle. We had it easy, and then it started dawning on people that we were actually accomplices, and there started to be some fight back. It all started, the recent fight back against the Canadian complicity in the Anglo-American Empire started with the COVID vaccine. Once we were forced to have COVID vaccines, I wasn't even allowed to enter Canada. I had been in Europe at the time. I wasn't able to enter Canada for 2 years because I refused to get vaccinated. We had truckers' protests. We had citizens' protests. We had tens of thousands of people. We had the national capital blockaded. And now there is a growing underground in Canada that realizes that we were an American colony. There are some who still wish we were, because life is easier that way, but I'm not as small a minority as I used to be. I'm now one of a growing group of Canadians who say, okay, thank God for Donald Trump. Why do I say that? Because Donald Trump has kicked us out of the nest. We're a fully grown bird. We're not a little chick coming out of the egg. We are a fully grown country that it's gone past its centennial. We are now at 150-year-old country, and it's high time we started being independent.
Do you think maybe this has got something to do with the fact that Canada is quite close to the Europeans, that there have been these problems?
I would suggest that Canada realizes, Canada has always known that we're living in the shadow of a giant. And so long as we were friendly to the giant and we gave the giant whatever it wanted, everything was groovy, everything was fine. But now the giant wants more. Donald Trump has a particular political style, which is shock politics, like shock economics. He makes a shock announcement and then he watches the fallout. So when he said that Canada should become the 51st state, well, the Canadians were divided. Of course, the Quebecers said never. The eastern Canadians, that's where I live in the Maritime and Atlantic provinces, we're very much closer to England, so we're all saying no. Then as you go towards the center, Ontario is much more of an economically oriented province, so they're split. There is a minority there of, let's say, 20% who wouldn't be unhappy to be in America. And as you go west and you head towards Alberta, which is the oil field of Canada, you can say that as many as 40% of the people in Alberta might be quite happy to be selling their oil to America for top dollar. British Columbia is another matter altogether. It has good ties with England, and I think that the number of British Columbians who want to join America is quite small. So the country is somewhat split on the topic, but the majority everywhere is against being incorporated into the United States. And
so what do you make of this confrontation between Trump and Zelensky last Friday evening? Because it was a 15-minute long press conference. 40 minutes of it went a little bit uncomfortable, but very well. Everyone being polite to each other. The last 10 minutes, which is probably why it was the last 10 minutes, it all sort of seemed to descend into insults, completely different views of whether or not it was feasible to trust the Russians or not, seemed to be the core. But anyway, what did you make of that?
Well, I think that Trump went into that meeting planning to reduce or cut off military support for Zelensky. And I say for Zelensky because, as we know, massive amounts of that money have disappeared and never went to the Ukrainian army, never went to the Ukrainian weapons program. It just went into the pocket of Zelensky. So Trump, being a businessman once again, does not want somebody to take $300+ billion from the American taxpayer when they're having a massive deficit and put it in his pocket. And Zelensky wasn't there as a typical recipient of massive piles of gold. Zelensky was there trying to psychologically pressure the President of the United States, and I knew when it was going to go south, and that was when Zelensky turned directly to the camera and attempted to lobby the American people. The minute that happened, the minute Zelensky stopped looking at JD Vance, Vice-President Vance, and stopped looking at Trump and looked directly at the camera and tried to sell his message over the head of egotist Donald Trump, that was game over. JD Vance stepped in, told him, mind your tongue and take note of where you are. And I think Trump was a little bit surprised at the tone that JD used. But once he got rolling, Trump put him in his place, put Zelensky in his place. And this works out fine for Trump, because Trump has got a massive financial crisis in America. They have a monstrous debt, the biggest debt in the history of the human race. There's nothing ever been close to this. And when Zelensky dropped the ball and started to play around the president and the vice president, Trump and Vance both got the cue that now's the time to nail this guy. And I think that they were waiting for an opportunity, and Zelensky, the fool that he is, the jester, the court jester that he is, he gave it to them.
Yeah, well, he was almost like he fell into a trap. He didn't have to fall, but it was almost inevitable that he was going to fall. But it was 4 days before he came back with a proper response, which kind of hints that Zelensky isn't really in charge. I mean, he'd been to see the European leaders, King Charles.
Zelensky's been a puppet since day one. Zelensky is the deep state puppet. How did Zelensky become the president of Ukraine? You know, we've got so many people who are either in an induced case of amnesia or just outright denial of known facts. Point one, when did the war in Ukraine start? 80% of Americans think that the war in Ukraine started in February 2022, 3 years ago. This is delusional. This is called mass delusion. This is the kind of thing that Joseph Goebbels achieved in Nazi Germany. That's what the lying mainstream media in England and in America achieved. The mass hypnosis of the people to let them think that there was no war in Ukraine until Russia forcefully and with its own soldiers crossed the Ukrainian border. Well, that is the biggest load of hogwash that has ever been perpetrated by the lying mainstream media. This war started, an out-and-out shooting war started in 2014. In 2014, the neo-Nazi, well, I may as well just say Nazi, because they wear Nazi swastikas, they wear SS uniforms, they give Sieg Heil salutes, they raise the swastika banner, they pose for photos in Nazi uniforms. So let's just say the Nazis in Ukraine, and that's Western Ukraine where they're concentrated, the Nazis in Ukraine burned alive 30 or 35 trade union activists in the center of the city of Odessa. That's in 2014. That was the beginning of the war. They burned them alive. Then the two sides started to defend themselves. Everybody in Ukraine has a hunting rifle. It was first the Russian, ethnic Russians, those are who the people were in the trade union. The ethnic Russians thought that they were going to be lynched. And indeed, lynchings started then. Neo-Nazis marching with torches in parades with Sieg Heil salutes down the streets of the cities all around Odessa. Russians fled. Odessa was turned into a ghost town. The Russians fled in numbers towards the southeast of the country where they are the majority. And the regular army of Ukraine, I mean, this is an army that was created to fight international wars. They have fighter jets, they have attack helicopters, they have state-of-the-art tanks. They had this in 2014. That army started rolling east and southeast to kill Russians and to bring the Russian uprising, because the Russians said, we're not having any of this, we're out. That's when the war started. That war continued for 8 long years, while the BBC, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and the Canadian CBC all lied to the entire listening and viewing audience to suggest that that was just a minor skirmish, if they mentioned it at all.
Well, one thing they did say was they talked about the annexation of Crimea, didn't they? And this sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Poo-poo the referendum. But look,
internationally monitored referendum, and I was invited to be a monitor of that referendum, and unfortunately I couldn't go, but other Canadians went, and other Americans went, and people in Serbia went as well, and they monitored that referendum. And these are people who I know personally, and if they saw any foul play, any ballot stuffing, they would have reported it. These people went there and they gave that referendum a clear bill of health. And the result was overwhelming. We're talking about over 90% of those who voted wanted Crimea to join Russia. And then Russia moved its little green men, that means soldiers without markings, and local sympathizers who are ethnic Russians, and members of the Russian fleet, which, if you'll remember, were based in Crimea, simply moved off of their boats, and they implemented the referendum. And you know, people on the Russian side, I consider myself pro-Russian. Not because I'm pro-communist. My family was exiled from the former Yugoslavia for 60 years because we were anti-communists. But those of us who are on the Russian side in this conflict, because of the principles involved, all of us know that this referendum passed overwhelmingly. Why? because the population of Crimea is more than 90% ethnic Russian. So it's natural that if you have over 90% of the population being ethnic Russian, and they're asked whether they want to join Russia to protect themselves from Ukrainian neo-Nazis who are slaughtering them, well, I'm surprised that 100% didn't vote to separate.
Well,
but
no.
there we have it.
John, let's bring this up right up to date, because when Zelensky got a ticking off from Trump and Vance, was sent with his tail between his legs, came back to London the weekend at Chequers with Keir Starmer, and then a meeting with all the European leaders. Was a big.
He read the script. He's an actor.
Zelensky on the ground.
Zelensky is
the call from the European leaders was about getting boots on the ground in Ukraine as a security guarantee. Only problem was that actually the Canadians and the French were making noises that they might do. The British were very enthusiastic to get British army boots on the ground in Ukraine. But the rest of them, including actually Ursula von der Leyen, the president of Europe, she was saying it was a great idea, but she doesn't actually have any soldiers herself. So it was a bit of an empty. Anyway, so most of Europe, particularly the Italians, basically just said, no, we're not doing this. So what do you think? What's the future for Ukraine now? You think?
Well, wait. Let's just deal with that. First of all, the last time the Italians sent troops into Ukraine, they were killed to the last man. The Germans know what happened to them. The Germans know that if they go again, they'll be slaughtered. Even the Poles, who have an enmity against the Russians that is incredible, even they know that there's no go for this. So I would say that England is the main instigator of all of this. America has been the undereducated, historically uninformed grunt that England has been pushing into battles for a long time in the Anglo-American alliance. Now remember, if you look at the alphabet, Anglo is not before Amero, American. So why would it not be the Amero-Anglo alliance? Normally the more powerful party is listed first. Well, in fact, the more powerful party is listed first. Despite the fact that England has less money, despite the fact that England has less weapons and less soldiers, it is England that has been leading the American donkey, and I picked donkey because it's mostly been the Democrats, the war party of America. England has been leading the American donkey into wars for years. And Biden, the Democrat donkey, was deep into this one. He even sent his son over there to take bribes, to sleep with prostitutes, to smoke crack on film. That's how deep in the Americans were. But it was
Iraq, Tony Blair was absolutely adamant that he had to do it for the Americans, that he didn't dare to upset them.
Tony Blair is a consummate liar of the first water. Tony Blair is a man for hire. Tony Blair is a guy who got hired by the Serbian government. Lord only knows why. Probably because Tony Blair said, I can arrange for you not to get bombed again. The Serbian government gave Tony Blair $5 million to be an advisor. Is that believable? This is the crazy world we live in. Tony Blair is a warmonger par excellence. This guy is top war. He came from modest background and he became a very, very, very rich man by selling out his party, by selling out what was once a left-leaning party and turning it into a leading member of the war machine, just like the German Green Party became a camouflage war green party. There has been
we've got to pin down the future for Ukraine, because do you think there's going to be some negotiations between the Russians? How do you think this is going to go now? With only the British saying that they want to put boots on the ground, and actually the Russians may say, well, if any British boots appear here, you've been firing your Storm Shadow missiles at our cities and our radar nuclear defence bases. So if any British appear there, we're just going to kill them.
Of course they will. They'll kill them and they'll hang them by their boots. And you'll have some British boots in Ukraine, but they won't be on the ground. They'll either be hanging upside down like Mussolini, because that's how Britain is behaving now. Then I don't want to say Britain. Let's just say it as it is. The Anglo-English who ruled the Celts of Britain. But anyway, the British Army is the most aggressive, most war-oriented, money-oriented imperial war machine that there is. And they've been just using the dumb American donkey to make war. If the British send their troops over there, Russia will enjoy killing them. And all those British boots on the ground in Ukraine are not going to be on the ground. They're going to be 6 feet under the ground.
Will Putin and Trump be able to force a ceasefire of some sort, do you think?
Of course. Trump and Putin. First of all, the Russian forces in Ukraine are 100% under Putin's control. This Prigozhin mutiny and this strange series of events that took place, that is over as it can get. On the Ukrainian side, if the Americans say stop, the Ukrainians had better stop within 1 second, because if they don't, then all of the American satellite guidance, all of the weapon systems, everything will cease working. And the Ukrainians are going to be using, the Ukrainians are going to be using pitchforks.
They've switched that off today. No more intelligence today.
No. When they totally turn the weapons off, I'm not talking about no more intelligence. I'm talking about remote disabling of the F-16s. I'm talking about remote disabling of the American guns. I'm talking about remote disabling of the electronic warfare inside the weapons that the Ukrainians have. That's the end. Right now they've said, we're not bringing you more weapons. We're going to give you an embargo of new weapons and ammunition. That's one thing. The next step is disabling the current weaponry in the Ukrainians' hands. Expect that within 7 days.
Right. So are we going to have, do you think, a peace line, a new border for eastern border for Ukraine along the present contact line? Is that going to be?
I don't think.
Are the Ukrainians and the British going to get their security guarantees at all?
Look, Ukraine is the heartland of the Russian people. Ukraine is as Russian as Kosovo is Serbian. That's where my main focus has been over these years. You cannot give Ukraine to the West. You cannot give a neutral Ukraine to the West. Ukraine has to be totally disarmed, and it has to be like a Finland, but it has to lean toward Russia. If that is not achieved, the Russian army is going to Kiev, right up to the border of Poland, and good night for Zelensky, the neo-Nazis, and the English agents who have been pulling the strings and speaking the voice, ventriloquists who have been running this completely incompetent jester named Zelensky.
Well, I mean, he's competent in terms of getting lots of people killed and annoying the Russians, which seems to be one of the main aspects.
I actually don't even think he annoys the Russians. I think the Russians are overjoyed that Zelensky is the figurehead puppet leader for the West in Ukraine. If it was Poroshenko, if it was somebody else, it would be different. But the fact that this guy who can't put a tie on, who walks around with his gruff voice as if he had some authority, some gravitas, this guy, if Russia could pay to put an idiot in power in Kiev, they couldn't find anybody better than Zelensky.
Well, there have been also events this week in Serbia, haven't there, with the parliament, firecrackers and things going off. Can you just give us a bit of the background, your take on all that?
Well, this is a diversionary tactic, usually throwing smoke bombs and grenades in the Serbian parliament. Well, ever since the NATO puppets took over after they deposed President Milosevic. Now remember, President Milosevic came from the Communist Party that exiled my family for 60 years. I support President Milosevic. I met President Milosevic. I interviewed President Milosevic. This man was attempting to save the Kosovo heartland of Serbia, and he was attempting not to be forced into NATO. That's why he was murdered at The Hague. But since Milosevic, there has been a retinue of puppets, traitors, collaborators, and so on. And the current president is the closest thing we've had to a nationalist president of Serbia, and he ranks a 1 out of 10 in nationalism. So he is compromised, he is blackmailed, he has an entire clique of LGBTQP people all around him, and perhaps he's a member of that group. We have a headless chicken government in Serbia, and now if you throw a few firecrackers and smoke bombs into the parliament, it makes people think that it might collapse. But it is not going to collapse, because the people who are running this regime for President Vucic know that if he falls, they fall. And there's been a lot of money missing over there as well. So he has a clique of very corrupt people around him. He might be able to salvage himself if he hangs on to Kosovo, because Serbs will put up with almost any imbecile in power if he doesn't give Kosovo away. If he gives Kosovo away, his lifespan is going to be so short that a stopwatch couldn't time it.
Oh dear. So you think this is, who's orchestrated this then, if you think it's
England,
firecrackers?
England, as usual. England has its fingers everywhere in Serbia. England's agents are everywhere. I mean, I know several of them personally. One of them left Serbia to go and run the operation in Ukraine. These guys they permeate the Serbian landscape. How is that possible? How did that happen? Well, the English played up to Serbia after World War I and pretended to be Serbia's friend. They, after World War II, then took the royal family in exile. I'm related to our last king. He went to England in exile. He was betrayed by England, which gave power to the English agent named Josip Broz, better known by his nom de guerre, Tito. They put their agent in power because Tito was more reliable to them than their cousin. You understand, King Peter II, our last king, was the cousin of the King of England. The cousin was betrayed by his own cousin, just like the King of England betrayed his cousin, the Tsar of Russia. Why? Because England hates the great land power, Russia, more than anything else in this universe.
What do you think is at the heart of that hatred? Because I think, for many people have wondered about this over the years. Napoleon, Hitler, and now it seems like King Charles. He says that Putin is the new Hitler.
King Charles is playing the banjo to the tune written for him by his advisors. Charles knows better. He's been down. Charles's father was an Orthodox Greek prince, would have been king. Charles was baptized Orthodox Christian. Charles knows everything about this. So it's not Charles speaking when he says that. It's Charles's advisors in council, in the Privy Council, who are telling him, you're going to call Putin a new Hitler. Why? Because, yes, sir. That's what the King of England says to his advisors. Yes, sir. Because they pull his strings. They've got so much dirt on him after the affair with Diana. After all of these, there is so much dirt on him that he is perhaps the most blackmailed human being on this earth. And if Charles says Putin is the new Hitler, number one, he's forgotten what his own mother put up with being bombed. He is also lying through his teeth, and I hope the average English citizen knows that for a fact.
Yeah, well, quite a lot are very sceptical about what happened with Diana. You're quite right. But what about, I mean, this business of the Orthodox Church fascinates me, actually. I mean, I have a kind of affection as a Quaker for all these sort of old traditions of Christianity, which it seems that, you know, as early as the 4th century, when we had the formation of the Roman Catholic Church with Constantine, and then we had Luther in the 16th century, the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries. You know, you go around Britain, you see all of these beautiful old monastic buildings just now in ruins, which people must have thought it was the end of the world, because they were providing education, they were providing healthcare, hospitals, they were building all the things that people needed to build mills and roads and everything. So to see them all just smashed to pieces by Henry VIII must have been pretty traumatic. But I mean, the Orthodox attitude, I think, is quite an interesting, and that is, of course, Serbia. This is Russia. Do you think there's any elements of hatred have got to do with these much newer versions of Christianity than the original from Asia Minor, the original Orthodox?
Well, I think that the hatred is multi-layered. The fundamental hatred is the hatred of Germanic Angles and their Saxon blade cutters against Slavs. This is the fundamental hatred. Above that, you have the hatred of the sea power against the land power. Russia is the world's greatest land power, army on the ground, and England has been the greatest sea power, and it's been inherited by the United States, but the United States is basically an extension of the English Empire. So this is the second level. Then the third level is a religious level, which is the concentration of power in the hands of the Pope and in the hands of the moderator of the church in England, the concentration of power in the church too much in the hands of the politically oriented people, whereas Orthodoxy is, at least in principle, supposed to be separated from the state to the point that the synod decides who the patriarch is without the emperor or the king telling them who it will be. And when Henry VIII just said, this is it, I'm going to cut the heads off of people until I get the one I want, this didn't happen in our countries. You could not be taking the head of the church. You could not depose the head of the church because the people believed in God, and their belief in God was greater than their belief in the king or in the emperor. So the Orthodox faith is much more, let's use the word mystical. In other words, it is not something that is debatable among the people. I'm an Eastern Orthodox, a Serbian Orthodox Christian. I am not a person who can quote the Bible to you at length, but I will not give up my faith for any bribe, for any threat, under any circumstances. My family fought the Ottoman Empire. My own family fought the Ottoman Empire for 400 years without ever considering surrender. We were displaced and we fought during migration. We never, ever would give up our faith because faith is above the king. Faith is above the Tsar or the emperor. And therefore, we don't have a situation where the king can just say, that's it, off with her head, I'll have a new wife now. Can't be done.
Interesting. So we're just into Lent now, a bit of fasting hopefully going on if people have got the faith to do so. But I'll just leave you with a kind of related question to the spiritual, and that is really to do with Jesus throwing out the money changers from the temple. I wonder, do you think there's any point in really listening to, following what Donald Trump is up to if he doesn't deal with the problem he's got with the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Act and the whole way that money is controlled through credit in the United States?
I think that, I'm very, very optimistic. I'm pleased to hear that you're a Quaker, and I believe in God, and I do believe that we're headed into a real conflict here between good and evil, and I think that Donald Trump has a better sense of what good and evil are than many presidents in the recent times. Regardless of all this stuff about grabbing women by the pussy and so on, Donald Trump fundamentally wants to make things better. Not just for himself, not just for the rich people, but he actually wants to go down in history as a great president. That's why he compared himself to George Washington. Donald Trump wants to go down in history as the greatest president of all time. And the only way that can happen is if he ends the wars, if he puts everybody to work, and if he makes a peaceful planet. If he does that, regardless of his yellow hair and all of the things he's done, if he does that, if he achieves that from this mess that we're in globally today, then he will be the greatest U.S. president ever. And, he doesn't need to be reelected again because he cannot serve another term. And that means that the Israel lobby that has literally had him by the balls until now no longer has any leverage over him. And if Donald Trump recognizes the call of history, and if his ego is as big as his critics say it is, and I hope it is, he will take the right route, and he will end the war in Ukraine, and he will bring the Palestinians to a state, regardless of what he's saying for the cameras now.
But will he deal with the Federal Reserve, this massive...
Oh, yeah, he has to deal with that. The Federal Reserve, the system of governance in the United States, the bribery, all of it. The Federal Reserve is not a department of the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve is a private institution that allows the U.S. government to appoint several people. The rest of the body that runs the Federal Reserve is a clique of old banker families, most of them who left England and Germany when they were driven out and moved to America because that was where they could make more money than they ever made before. These are the banksters of the world. If he doesn't stop them, all of his dreams, all of his plans are impossible. Donald Trump has the challenge of the millennium to deal with now. Maybe he can do it. I guarantee that I've never, ever seen an American politician of any party, of any name, of any politics who had a better chance of doing